Yo, what up, guys? Sleep Out of Christian Alpha here. We're just going to do a little video on a little podcast on mission and some practical takeaways, especially for you single dudes out there. This one's going to be super important, so tune in because what we're about to share with you could get you a wife someday, or you could just be single if you don't listen to us.
Why is that a laughable thing?
I just find it hilarious. It's just, my personality. If you don't want to listen to us, you can go forever.
Oh no, I'm saying or you could be single, ha ha ha. Like that's such a pathetic thing.
Oh, it's not a pathetic thing, but it's a good thing to have a wife, to find a wife.
That is Proverbs, yes. He who finds a wife finds a good thing. But is that
according
true
to
today?
1 Corinthians 7, he who doesn't finds a better thing.
I think that's a paraphrase. I don't know if I buy the John paraphrase on that one. I'm going to go ahead and just derail. I'm going to go ahead and derail this conversation from the very start. So, as somebody who has been studying preterism, do you still hold that the 1 Corinthians 7 admonitions from Paul, due to this present distress, recommending singleness, has nothing to do with the impending destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD? Or is it possible that he was advising people who were about to endure a fairly apocalyptic event in their lives, that now is not the time to begin a family, as would be my
Exactly. Real quick for context, what is preterism? Nobody else, I think, would recognize that.
In a nutshell, most of the apocalyptic prophecy in the Bible was fulfilled in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There's a lot of attendant issues that go beyond that, but that's kind of the heart of it.
Okay, right. So that is preterism.
Yeah, it's essentially the view that most of Revelation has already been fulfilled, and therefore we're not waiting for some tribulation coming up in the future.
Left Behind, folks, BTFO.
Okay, so John, what's your take?
Yeah, so on the 1 Corinthians 7 issue, I'd say that the present distress is not necessarily tied to I don't see any evidence that it would be tied specifically to the coming destruction of the temple. There's no evidence in 1 Corinthians that I am aware of that Paul is speaking prophetically toward an end time type end that he's looking forward to. And so instead, I think he's just talking about, look, guys, this world is a messed up place right now. And, that's kind of reminds me of the title of Deep Strength's book, right? Biblical Masculinity Blueprint. And I forget the tagline, but it's basically, relation or training for men for biblical masculinity in a messed up world. And I think that we are still in a messed up world, that the present distress is still going on, that the world is still hostile toward Christianity, maybe not in the same ways in our country, but there are certainly countries where it's being treated the same way that it was back then, where Christians are literally being killed, and others where it's more a stripping of legal rights and all that. So I would say that the present distress is ongoing, and that it wasn't something that was temporary, whereas, especially for the Jewish people, it was not a present distress, 500 years ago, when Israel was still its own independent nation.
So you're saying...
Real quickly, if I'm going to jump in here and just read the verse at hand, just so we're not just talking about a verse, but actually quoting one. So this is 1 Corinthians 7:25 through 28. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present, or in some translations, impending distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that.
That's solid verse. So John, you were saying that the present distress then was from essentially that point forward in history and doesn't apply to any time in the past.
I wouldn't say it doesn't apply any time in the past.
because if you do say it applies, if it doesn't apply in the past, then all the scripture, and I'll have to Google something while you're responding, but there's plenty of scripture supporting, like especially Old Testament, finding a wife or obtaining a wife. Wife were more of property back then, but finding a wife, and that's a good thing in using that to further your mission or to propagate your lineage and collect more resources.
Right. So in the age of the Old Testament, that absolutely was the case, because, and I should clarify before I go too much further on that, it's not just Paul saying that it's better not to marry. It's also Jesus saying that. Matthew 19 is a pretty plain on obvious one, where he says, if anybody has the capacity to stay single, he should. End of story. There's no present distress that's mentioned. It's just a flat out, if you can do it, because that's the preferred route. But Jesus also recognizes, as it seems Paul does as well, that that's not the path for most people. And so as I would encourage guys, pursue the single life if you can. I say that with the acknowledgement that 95% of guys, if not more, are going to end up in some form of marriage or another anyway, whether that's a state-sanctioned marriage or a marriage before God or whatever you want to call it.
Interesting.
So I would start off by saying that I definitely don't think that it's limited just to the present distress situation that Paul references, because of the way Jesus brings it up. However, when you go into the Old Testament, I'll let you go, Oz.
Let's go back to, you said Matthew 19, right?
Sure.
What verses are you referring to specifically?
I want to say it's 11. I can look it up, though.
So I'm going to just read 10 and 11 here. The disciple said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs. For the sake of the kingdom of heaven, let the one who is able to receive it, receive it. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. So it's 12 is really the verse I was looking at.
Okay. Will you expand on that?
I don't want to come and do it.
So
somebody
to
else
expand
is
on that,
going to have to.
I guess the context is Jesus basically saying, now I tell you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Basically saying, if you want to divorce your wife, that's fine, but you're not going to get remarried. And his disciples then go on and say to him, if this is the case between a man and his wife, it's better not to marry at all. And Jesus is basically saying, well, that's true. You probably shouldn't get married because you're going to really you kind of get stuck. And I would also note that in 1 Corinthians 7, as you reference, and I guess I should pull up this passage as well.
39, wife is bound to her husband as long as she lives, but if she marries, she's free to be married to whomever she wants,
No,
only
that's
in
not
the
the
Lord.
part I'm looking at. So after the present distress language, Paul
it's then he who marries his
explain.
betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better in 38.
I'm looking at 32, because that's where Paul gives his rationale for why he would prefer people to stay single. He says, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs, her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit, but the married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, meaning it's fine to still get married, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. And that's ultimately the rationale. I don't think that the present distress is the rationale, even though he uses it as an encouragement toward his advice. I think 32 through 35 are Paul's actual rationale, and he basically says that. Which I think is another funny thing to look here, because I want to say an unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, but he also says for women, an unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. I think it's interesting that he only references the virginity issue for women. And I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on that too.
I have a lot of thoughts, but I guarantee you we will rabbit trail for the rest of this. So
fair enough.
Turning it back really quick to the idea of the impending distress, as it's often translated. I think that it's very important not to overlook the consequences of what it is that Paul's saying here, in that he's departing from essentially all other views on marriage presented in the Bible. if we take it to be normative in all cases. So where in all cases beforehand, marriage was presented as a blessing from the Lord, as something that God used to spread his kingdom, to perpetuate his people. I think Paul is making a very radical departure from that. And to do so, I think takes greater substantiation than merely saying that essentially it would be a distraction. Because was it a distraction for Abraham, Moses, Isaac, the rest of them? Well, certainly it was a worldly affair of sorts, but they were able to serve the Lord nonetheless. And so I think the impending distress has a much it's a much weightier issue than is being given credit for here. And then looking back at Matthew 19, just a quick comment on that. Do you think Jesus is talking more about the attitude toward marriage, or is this more of a scathing commentary toward his people who have a calloused attitude toward divorce? Because I think it may be the later.
That could be. But we have to take the words for what they say. And
well, he was just talking about divorce. So so he was just answering them on divorce. He was saying in verse 8, he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying. And basically, if you can't handle that as the paradigm, as in you shouldn't divorce your wife except for sexual immorality, then you probably shouldn't get married, I think is the contextual understanding of that passage.
Okay.
I'd be curious if there's any reason why that couldn't be the case.
No, I don't see why that couldn't be the case. But I would also say that we're in a world right now where the divorce rates are way higher than we would see in ancient Israel. So I'm not sure how that, especially in a modern context, wouldn't actually even more broaden the scope of who that verse is meant to apply to.
So I think that again is another topic as far as like, is marriage advisable in the church today under the current paradigm and our current legal systems? I mean, that's an episode of a podcast altogether right there. I think there's something to be said here, though, if you look at Jesus's audience. So you have a group of disciples who are used to the reigning paradigm, which is if you find any fault in your wife, you can put her away and divorce her. So basically, no fault divorce in one direction. And Jesus says, actually, no, you can't do that. You only have these conditions in which you can divorce your wife. And the disciples go, well, that doesn't sound like a good deal. Then he says, well, then don't get married, basically. Stay single if you can't abide by that. And I think that even if we look at marriage, after he said those words, and you look at marriage through most of Christian history, there was a pretty stable understanding of marriage and that it was a societal good and it was a building block of society. I think that if you look at what we've bastardized marriage into becoming in the last couple centuries, we're at kind of a different crossroads.
Yeah, and that would make sense that we would then want to encourage marriage if our goal in society was to rebuild stability in the way that it historically was, I guess. But at the same time, we always recognize that the church's goal is not necessarily toward a physical kingdom, but a spiritual one, right? And so this is when you and Levi both bring up comments about how, well, historically, Israel was always about, go get married, propagate the species, have lots of children, build a lineage, right? That legacy was a big part of Israel's history, but why was it a big part of Israel's history? And so one of the premises that I always work from is that whatever God does in the Old Testament in a physical, tangible way is meant to be interpreted as a foreshadow to the spiritual things that he does that we couldn't understand until the gospel, right? And so there's all kinds of things that we see in the Old and New Testament. One of the easy ones to point out is circumcision, right? Paul talks about how in the Old Testament, God used the physical example of circumcision of the flesh to reference the spiritual concept of circumcision of the heart that would come and be understood when Jesus died. And in the same way, I would say that physical marriage was meant to be a foreshadow to the things that we would do as the church in our spiritual marriage to Christ, and that everything that God intended through physical marriage in the Old Testament was not for the end of physical marriage, but to point toward that spiritual reality. And so that's why when we look at, and I often like to cite the Malachi 2:15, where it says, and why did the Lord God make them one? To produce godly offspring, or I guess commingling a pure portion of his spirit in their union. To produce godly offspring is the reason, right? So the reason God creates husbands and wives, gives them sex, is so that they can produce offspring for the Lord. But it's not just any offspring, it says godly offspring. And the reason for that distinction is because back in Adam and Eve's time, right, they did create offspring, they just weren't godly. And so the people that they were filling the earth with were just warm bodies that didn't ever glorify God. And so God gets to the Noah age and says, all right, well, that's not what I meant when I told you to fill the earth. I don't want the earth filled with those kind of people. So I'm going to wipe them all out and start all over again with Noah, who's really the only faithful person left at the time. Right. And so I get the idea here that all along God was interested in the spiritual life of the people filling the earth, not the physical life. And because of that, what we produce through physical marriage is not the goal, but what we produce through our spiritual union with Christ by giving life into those who are born dead, by helping them become born again. That's where the whole purpose of marriage is, and that's what it was all leading toward in the first place. And you don't need to have a physical marriage anymore to accomplish that goal. Not to say it's not good to have that. Definitely great to be married. But it would be even better and more productive for those who are able to focus on the mission and make disciples without it.
Okay. Well, can I?
Go ahead, Levi. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, given that advice that Jesus gave wasn't for the majority, like he said, hey, like all Christians, like it'd be great if you could do this, but most of you guys aren't going to be able to do this. So I don't see this huge emphasis on living a single life for God. And that's something I think that is overemphasized in church and maybe in RPC. Even for women, like right now you see a lot of women that are older and single, and most of the, like, evidentially, or just evidence-based, most of them have lived this really secular life, rode the cock carousel, and now they're like, it would have been much more beneficial for them, and I believe firmly for the kingdom of heaven, if they had paired themselves with a godly guy sooner rather than later. So I just think that there's not as much emphasis, like Jesus isn't giving as much emphasis, like, hey, you guys should all be single, like that's great, because that really is a minority of guys. So if you're emphasizing majority advice that was meant, or if you're emphasizing minority advice to the majority, it seems like there's a mismatch there.
Real quick before I forget the point, I want to quickly address what John had said a moment ago about the differences between the operating of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And one of the things that he had mentioned was circumcision being a foreshadowing physically of the circumcision of the heart that was to come in the New Testament. And as a point of clarification, the circumcision of the heart was something that was a thematic element throughout Scripture. So in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, the Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, and you will love him with all your heart, all your soul, so that you may live. In Jeremiah 4:4, circumcise yourselves to the Lord, remove the foreskins of your heart, O men, Judah, the people of Israel, otherwise my wrath will break out like fire. Jeremiah 9:25, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish all of those who are who are circumcised yet uncircumcised. So all throughout the Old Testament, we still see that as a thematic element, that God was still interested in the circumcision of the heart, and the physical circumcision was still pointing to that actively in real time, even while God had an operating paradigm that involved the gospel in that world in the Old Testament. When we look at Abraham, why was Abraham justified? It was by faith. We learn that's the point of Romans, effectively, especially the early chapters, is that the way that Abraham was saved is the same way that we are saved now in the New Testament. So there's not a discontinuity there. And so while I understand the emphasis on that, we make spiritual disciples, and that's one of the ways in which we can propagate the kingdom, so to speak. I don't think that has taken away from the propagation of physical offspring that are godly offspring. And I think that as we push further away from physicality and into spirituality, we run into a very Gnostic approach to the world. And I think that there are attendant issues with that particular worldview. I think maybe specifically we look at what is to be redeemed in the New Testament. Is it just people's souls, or is creation itself to be redeemed? And I think it's both. And I think that's a biblically defensible position. And if that is the case, then we have to change a little bit about how we approach the physical world. And I think we see a lot of get people on the lifeboat and get them off this thing because it's all about to burn, and that God doesn't have a plan for this other than to throw it in the lake of fire. You think about the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on where? Earth, as it is in heaven. Well, what is the kingdom of God? Well, it's something that can be done on earth too. And so I think that when we look at what expands the kingdom, it's something that involves physicality. And so I think, as I guess maybe a defense of the idea of marriage as a propagation of the kingdom, that I think is a worthwhile pursuit, and something that if we over spiritualize, we can lose the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
I think that's probably why Mormonism it might be a little bit attractive. Get to bang women and make spiritual babies up in heaven.
You know, it's interesting you say spiritual babies, but the banging is physical in Mormon theology. So insofar as even Elohim went down and physically banged Mary. So they have a very strong understanding of the physicality, and maybe too strong in many cases.
I've always wondered how that moment went with Mary, if there was any sort of, anything there, or if it was just like, this really spiritually touching moment where she just felt like, I'm in the presence of the Lord. Like, was this a different experience from the experience when Jesus visited people in the Old Testament and they were like, oh, Lord,
tick off
like,
a lot of Catholics right now.
Yeah, Catholics are all, I can hear their keyboards firing up right now, Levi. Watch yourself.
I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm not saying. It's just a thought. And I know that every Catholic, if they're being honest with themselves, has had the same fleeting thought, even if it was sin. I'm not saying it is sin, but even if it was sin, you thought it. Don't lie to yourself.
Please direct all hate mail toward Levi Catholics. I have other fights to pick with you. This is not one of them.
So where were we?
We were discussing, I should say, since arguing is a bad word these days. We were discussing whether or not physical offspring as a result of marriage is a I guess defensible goal. And I think that part of the reason why this topic is worth discussing is that you see two kind of approaches, I suppose, to this question in RPC. You have kind of the dominant, I would say, paradigm, and I think John probably could speak more to this as far as, and he already articulated much of this, that the focus is really on the creating spiritual offspring via evangelism. And I think that begs questions as to what is the role of marriage? Is it something that Christian men ought to pursue, or is it something that is just a potential byproduct of living your mission? And if it comes along and you can't help yourself, then that's what you got to do. And I think that if it's the later, and that's our reigning paradigm, then we're going to have a very different approach to advising single men, bringing it back to what we said we were going to talk about. If marriage is not the pursuit, if it's not something worth pursuing, then our advice to single men is going to look very different than if marriage itself is worth pursuing. If it's something that is a byproduct of living a mission elsewhere, then our advice would be, we'll go live your mission elsewhere, and let's just talk about how do you live that mission. If there's, hey, single men, you it's okay and you ought to pursue a wife, then we can talk about here's how you do it, and we can get tactical about it. And so I think that's where the dividing line kind of lines up with these two views and why this is an important discussion.
So a lot of my advice toward guys who are out there actively pursuing wives isn't that it's bad to want to be married or pursue a wife. It's one, because a lot of those guys have not actually evaluated, am I doing this because I actually want a wife and want all of that? Or am I doing it because I've been conditioned by cultural social scripts that tell me that the proper thing to do is go get married, have kids, get the house with the white picket fence and all of that, right? And so I want guys to evaluate, why are you doing something? Is it coming out of your frame, or is it because some societal standard or social norm is pushing you in that direction? And then the second reason why I want guys to be thinking about this and caution guys away from it is because a lot of guys who are out there pursuing wives are making that the sole and primary focus of their life. And that's where the real problem is they're going on dates, every other day thinking, oh my goodness, I've got to find one and I have to be married by this age and whatever. And so they put so much time and energy and effort into this that they completely abandon anything that they otherwise could be doing that would be more productive with their lives. And in the meantime, because and so this is, I guess, a third point, because they are abandoning the things that they could be doing that are mission oriented and pursuing, then they lose sight of who they really are and what it is that they're supposed to be doing or want to do with their lives, or that God has called them to do with their lives. And as a result of that, they don't know what they're even inviting a woman to follow them toward. And so how can any woman possibly know if they want to follow such a man? And how can he know if she's going to be a helpful follower on a mission that they haven't even started yet? And so that's where I really struggle with a lot of guys who are out there trying to intentionally say, I've got to get married, I've got to date lots of women, I got to find a wife, without even knowing who they are as a man yet. And that's really the serious problem that I try to avoid and push guys against. Once they are actively pursuing their mission, my guess is that most guys are going to acknowledge that, especially with the sexual temptation in the world, it's going to be more advantageous for them to be able to avoid that type of sin and just get married and have a woman to help them along the way.
Yeah, one is more, I think, emphasis on finding a mission and being single is more in line with what you see, guys, gosh, I have to think of guys that people aren't going to Instagram and look up big booty pics. Brad Pitt, guys like Christian Brad Pitt or whatever. He's got a mission. His mission isn't to find a wife. And I think it's good. Like, and I'm kind of taking like an in-between stance where guys coming to our, the red pill in general, whether it's Christian or not, maybe red pill Christians is more geared towards married guys, but a lot of guys come with the thought in mind of pursuing a woman or getting a woman or whatever, getting some pussy. And so having the emphasis of like, hey guys, get a mission, like be single, and then secondarily, or like less emphasis, it's okay to have finding a wife as part of your mission, but don't make that your mission, because that's actually blue pill. That's actually going along with the cultural narrative. And like you said, John, they don't have a chance to know who they are as a man. They're not established, and they're definitely, they're not living up to their fullest potential with mission and making disciples and expanding the kingdom of heaven. I think that should come. Well, I know that should come first. So you should just firmly, it's just evidence. You see this with guys that aren't even Christian. You see guys that are just crushing it on their mission. They have all these women that are orbiters that would love to be a part of their life, and it's a mindset for them. And then some girl catches their eye or whatever, and they eventually get married. So having having that paradigm, I think, is more effective for God.
So let me just make my position kind of clear here. I don't disagree that most guys who make marriage their mission are not only going to end up settling for somebody if they can manage to attract anyone that is not worth their time, and they're going to lead them nowhere because they are going nowhere. So I want to agree with that wholeheartedly, that I think the majority of guys need to hear, dude, you need to figure out what your life is about before you go ruin anyone else's, because you've already managed to jack yours up. So sort that out first. And so I want to make sure that everyone understands that would be a very advisable position, that most guys, when they're approaching the point of, I would really like to have some sort of woman in my life, that the answer is probably not you need a woman in your life right now. The answer is you need to do a lot of serious work on yourself, and your relationship with God is part of that for sure, but you also need to lift, shut up, read, go make some money, do the things that are going to put you in a position that you are going to be able to do that well. So I want to agree with all of that. I think that one of the things that I see most often is when guys get this kind of out of line where they say, I don't want to I don't want to be single. I have all these urges, all of these things are going on, and I really want to find a wife. And what advice do they get in the church most often?
Hello? Yeah. Oh, I'm on a podcast right now. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, probably later. Whoop. Guys, sorry about the interruption there.
Back to
yeah, it's okay, Levi. I forgive you. Oh man. essentially, guys get terrible advice when they go to the church and they say, I want to find a wife. And I think that there's a reason why they want to, and that reason is good. Guys want food because they're hungry. Like that's a God-given desire to motivate people to do the things that they need to do to feed themselves. Like there's a reason why that's there. And I think there's a whole other conversation that we've alluded to that we haven't really gotten into and don't have time to get into with, okay, is marriage today worth pursuing the way that it had been in the past? And I think that's, again, a big question that I'm still developing thoughts around, because, you know, if a young single guy who's killing it, crushing it, he has all these orbiting girls around him, whatever, and he says, man, I really want to get married, I want to do things right, I, you know, don't want to have sex outside of marriage, what should I do? That becomes a dicier question when we start looking at the current state of marriage and what is going on in our culture. One of the points I guess I would throw out there is, at a certain point, something that if you change the definition of something so far, it ceases to become what it is. So if somebody came up to you and said, we'll use Levi as a single guy example here. Levi goes to his pastor and says, hey, pastor, I have this great girl, I want to get married, will you give me my blessing? I just don't want to do it by the state. And the pastor most likely would probably say, well, no, I don't support that, neither does this congregation. You have to go through the full channels of weddings according to all of our cultural norms. And that, I think, would be the default position.
Happen.
Right. And I think that would be the default answer to get in most churches, and maybe for so good reason in some places. I'm sure John would have a lot of insight into this from his perspective as a lawyer that deals with these issues. That all said, if somebody, let's imagine, woke up 50 years from now out of a coma and they met a great girl and they went to the pastor and said, hey, I want to get married. And he says, great. Has she already been inseminated by a government agent? And you go, what are you talking about? Oh yeah, that's how marriage is done nowadays. You've been away for 50 years, but now every time if you want to get married, they have to be, you know, inseminated artificially by a government agent so that you can help, you know, support the propagation of the state or something. I would hope that most churches would say, well, that's not marriage by any biblical stretch of the definition, and so we can't support that. And so I think using that as a poor analogy and walking that back, at a certain point, we have to arrive at the conclusion that marriage as it is not marriage as it was designed. And at a certain point, the church is going to have to step off of that train track and say, we got to go a different way, because what is marriage now is not what the Bible prescribes as marriage. So I think that's a whole other host of issues that are facing the church and young guys right now. And I don't envy them that position.
Yeah, guys, it's simple. The solution is simple. You just go to Mexico, you get married real quick, and you're golden. You know, pop back here, boom. You don't got to worry about it. Like, you were married in Mexico. Marriage laws only. Actually, I'm not the expert on that one, but that was just a brilliant idea that popped in my head. John, if I get married in Mexico and I get divorced in the U.S., do I have to go through all this, you know, mumbo jumbo that I would normally have to go through?
Had a case where I actually had a case where a guy was married in Ghana. Yeah, he was married in Ghana under Islamic law, and one of his arguments that he wanted me to perpetuate, which I kept telling him, it's never going to work, it's never going to work, and I've litigated this probably 3 or 4 times now, is he said, well, I told my wife I divorced her 3 times. I got a certificate from the Islamic State saying that I am divorced from her, and yet she's still suing me in your state for divorce because we both live here. And the judge's positions every time is, if you live and experience any portion of your marriage within the state that you are in the subjecting yourself to the divorce laws of that state. Did I cut out there?
So if you're, yeah, you cut out. But what I took away is basically, doesn't matter where you're married, as long as you're experiencing marriage in some part of America, America's marriage laws then apply to you.
Well, the laws of the state in which you live at the time the divorce is filed is the set of laws that your divorce is subject to. So it doesn't matter where you're married. What does matter is where you're getting divorced.
Yeah, basically. So got to go back to Mexico. Oh my goodness. Guys, find a country with the type of, John, do you have any recommendations for countries to get married in?
I think the question would be what countries to get divorced in. I think that's outside of the scope of giving advice to singles, Levi.
Probably is. That's definitely not my forte. We have the divorce lawyer here for that. Oh my gosh.
think part of what we're talking through here is the difference between the guys who find RPC from TRP and the guys who find it from MRP. And I feel like there's a lot of TRP guys who come to RPC thinking, oh my goodness, marriage sucks. Marriage is awful. I want nothing to do with it. I just want to be able to bang chicks. And why can't I do that as a Christian? Or what's a Christian way where I can do that and be spiritually married and not have to be technically living in sin? And so then there's another group of guys who are coming from MRP who have already married the traditional way, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, there's some value to this, but there's also some drawbacks, and they're evaluating it from a completely different angle. And so it's interesting trying to balance the needs of both camps of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And personally, I'm in the camp. I will say this is my opinion. Be like a Berean, check the scriptures, guys. And this has got to come 100% from faith. Romans 14:23, for whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. And that my stance is that if you're on an island and you get married to, and you want to marry a girl, it's just you and her, and you guys bang, and you know, there's a covenant there beforehand. You say, hey, I want to be together. This is between us and God, and you're stranded for the rest of your life. You're not in sin. So I'll let you guys kind of, take it from there. Use your imagination.
Well, I think we're about out of time, so we'll probably leave it at that. It's been a fun conversation, guys. I don't know if we reached any conclusions, but hopefully it's been illuminating for everybody all the same.
Sorry, singles. You kind of got left out in the dark again.
Oh, I think it was productive, but okay, guys, until next time, we love you all, and we'll see you in the next.
Stay safe.
Adios.